8. Ronnie ONeill III. Ronnie ONeill III had nowhere else to go in 2018 when he asked the mother of his two children, 33-year-old Kenyatta Barron, if he could stay at her home in Hillsborough County, Florida. O'Neill's family refused to house him, and Barron's loved ones warned her not to even let him inside. But out of the kindness of her heart, she said yes. She paid for it with her life when O'Neill brutally murdered her and their daughter in an uncontrolled rage. He also attacked his son before dousing the home in gasoline and setting it on fire. The little boy narrowly escaped with his life and was eventually adopted by a detective involved in the case. Going against the judge's advice, O'Neill represented himself at trial. He made a complete spectacle of himself by yelling at jurors, rambling about conspiracy theories, swearing, refusing to comply with the judge's orders, and accusing the prosecution of presenting fake evidence, despite testimony from numerous witnesses including his son, who saw the crimes firsthand. O'Neill's own family members refused to support him in the case and exited the courtroom during his closing argument. Not surprisingly, the jury convicted him of murder, attempted murder, arson, and several other charges. Describing the case as the worst she'd seen in her nearly 20-year career, Judge Michelle Cisco choked back tears as she sentenced O'Neill to 3 life terms, plus 60 years. 7. Rodney Alcala. By the time he appeared on the TV show The Dating Game in 1978, Rodney Alcala had already murdered at least 4 people. He took another victim the following year and dumped her body in the Los Angeles foothills. The victim's friends provided a description of Alcala, who'd approached them before the murder, and a sketch was circulated in the local media. At the time, Alcala was on parole for a previous crime. His parole officer recognized him as the man in the sketch, and a search of Alcala's storage unit turned up evidence linking him to the victim. He was convicted of murder in 1980, but was granted a new trial in 1986. Alcala was convicted again, but won yet another trial which began in 2003. Thanks to advancing DNA technology, detectives connected him with 4 cold case murders in California and New York and laid additional charges on him. During his 3rd trial, Alcala represented himself. He called himself to the stand and interrogated himself for 5 hours, asking himself questions in a deeper-than-normal voice and answering with an unnaturally high pitch. With each answer, his voice became increasingly high-pitched. Alcala claimed that he couldn't remember committing the murders, but made no attempt to dispute the allegations. He was convicted for a 3rd time and sentenced to death, but passed away from natural causes in 2021 at the age of 77. 6. Colin Ferguson. Dozens of New Yorkers experienced a living nightmare when 35-year-old Colin Ferguson opened fire on the Long Island Railroad one evening in 1993. The train had just pulled into a station when he began to pull the trigger repeatedly as he walked calmly through the car, killing 6 people and injuring 19 others. When all was said and done, the gunman had emptied 2 15-round magazines. Ferguson was loading a 3rd magazine into the gun when several passengers tackled him and held him against the floor until help arrived. Investigators found evidence indicating that he had planned the massacre at least a week ahead of time. Notes in the suspect's pocket indicated that the shooting was racially motivated and expressed hatred toward Asians and white people, along with certain politicians, government agencies, and civil rights activists. Representing himself at trial, Ferguson maintained his innocence and blamed the carnage on an unidentified white man who he claimed fled the scene. He received funding from Nassau County to hire a detective to track down the so-called real killer, which unsurprisingly turned up fruitless. Speaking in 3rd person, Ferguson argued that he was awakened by the gunfire and amid the confusion sought to protect himself. Witnesses were quick to shut that narrative down, with one man saying on the stand, "I saw you shooting at everyone on the train, okay?" Ferguson was convicted on 6 counts of murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. He's currently serving a 315-year prison sentence. 5. Lynette Fromm. After dropping out of school and being kicked out of her parents' house in 1967, 19-year-old Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm traveled to Venice Beach. That's where she met Charles Manson and joined the ranks of his Manson family cult. She quickly grew to idolize Manson, who found her sitting on a curb and asked her if her family had thrown her out. It was the exact situation she was in, causing her to believe that Manson was psychic. Fromm wasn't involved in the notorious murders of Sharon Tate, Leno, and Rosemary LaBianca that Mason and 3 of his followers were convicted of in 1971. But she supported him throughout the trial and moved into an apartment in Sacramento after he was sentenced so that she could be near Folsom Prison. To prove her devotion to Manson, Fromm went to Sacramento's Capitol Park, where President Gerald Ford was scheduled to stop during a visit to the area in 1975. Armed with a handgun in a leg holster, she drew the weapon and pointed it at Ford, but was instantly taken down by Secret Service agents. During her trial for the attempted assassination, Fromm refused to cooperate with the defense. She represented herself, but did not offer any testimony and was convicted of the charge. When U.S. Attorney Dwayne Keese described Fromm as full of hate and violence and recommended a harsh punishment, she threw an apple at him, hitting his face and knocking his glasses off. She received a life sentence. Fromm's volatile behavior and refusal to act in her best interests has led some to speculate that she was acting under Manson's influence. She was paroled in 2009 at the age of 60 and moved to New York State, where she lives with her boyfriend. During an interview with the New York Post in 2019, she said that she was still in love with Charles Manson, stating in her own words, "I feel very honored to have met him, and I know how that sounds to people who think he's the epitome of evil." 4. John Allen Muhammad. 39-year-old John Allen Muhammad's life hit a major low point in 1999 when his second wife divorced him and got a restraining order against him. In 2000, he fled to Antigua with their 3 kids. While there, he met a young man named Lee Boyd Malvo, and the pair formed what initially seemed like a father-son bond. Muhammad eventually returned to the US and settled down in Washington, D.C., where police caught up with him and returned the kids to their mother. Around the same time, Malvo moved to the area and proved to be a welcome but perhaps unhealthy distraction for Muhammad, who grew unusually attached to the young man. Before long, it seemed as though he had complete control over Malvo. In October of 2002, the pair began to shoot random civilians throughout the DC area, carrying out the attacks from a sniper's nest that Muhammad had built in the trunk of his car. They also started to harass and threaten the police. The men were finally arrested after leaving behind a brochure with fingerprints on it at the scene of one of their crimes. By then, they'd killed 10 people and injured 3, and they faced charges in multiple states. Muhammad requested permission to represent himself at one of his trials. His attorneys tried to stop it from happening, but the judge ultimately ruled that he was competent. He was convicted of murder in Virginia, Maryland, and the federal court sentenced him to death. Against his wishes, his appointed attorneys appealed his convictions and sentences. In 2008, Muhammad asked prosecutors to take legal action to put an end to the appeals. He was executed in Virginia by lethal injection the following year. 3. Nidal Hassan. One day in 2009, 39-year-old U.S. Army psychiatrist Nidal Hassan entered the Soldier Readiness Center at Fort Hood in Central Texas and yelled Allahu Akbar. He opened fire with a semi-automatic pistol, killing 30 people and wounding more than 30 others in the worst ever mass shooting at a U.S. military installation. The attack lasted for 10 minutes before military police shot and subdued Hassan, who was left paralyzed from the chest down from the gunshot. By the time he was apprehended, he had fired more than 200 shots. Prosecutors accused Hassan of carefully planning the attack. Evidence showed that he'd researched jihad on the internet, practiced shooting at a range, and exchanged messages with a high-ranking member of Al-Qaeda about the planned massacre. Acting as his own attorney, Hassan offered a brief opening statement about how he decided to switch sides in what he believed as an American war against Islam. He called no witnesses, gave no testimony, and made no further statements. In 2013, a military jury found Hassan guilty of 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted murder. He received the death sentence, but no military members have been executed since 1961, and the appeals process is exhaustive, making it unlikely that the punishment will be carried out anytime soon, if ever. Following his sentencing, he joined the military's small handful of other death row inmates at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where he remains today. 2. Wasim Daycare. Wasim Daycare was a teenager when he met Lottie Spencer in Atlanta in 1994. He soon began to tell her friends and family that they were in a relationship, but Spencer wasn't interested in him in that way. She would later accuse him of stalking her obsessively, claiming that he called up to 100 times a day, showed up at her house at all hours, and followed her in public. Spencer reported Daycare to police when his harassment escalated into threats of violence. His mother persuaded Spencer to drop the charges against him, and she moved in with her friend Carmen Smith in hopes that it would throw Daycare off her trail. But it didn't take long for him to catch up to her. After enduring Daycare's stalking for a year, Spencer came home one day in 1995 to find paramedics outside her home. Someone had stabbed Carmen to death and also attacked her young son, who luckily survived. Investigators suspected Daycare of being responsible for the murder, but lacked enough physical evidence to charge him in the case. They were able to prosecute him for stalking Spencer, which he received a 10-year prison sentence for. As his release date approached, detectives re-examined the evidence in Carmen's case in hopes of linking him to the murder and keeping him behind bars. Thanks to the advances in DNA technology, they were able to put him at the scene and charged him with murder. When Daycare represented himself at trial, the judge overseeing the case warned him that he was putting himself in harm's way. He was undeterred by the statement and appeared to relish the opportunity to question his victims on the stand. But if his plan was to prove his innocence, he failed, much to the relief of his victims, who can rest easy knowing that he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. 1. H.H. Holmes. Better known by his aliases Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and H.H. Holmes, Herman Webster Mudgett was a 19th century career criminal who spent his adulthood committing fraud, forging checks, and otherwise swindling money out of unsuspecting victims. He was also a horse thief and committed bigamy 3 or 4 times. But these crimes are trivial compared to the numerous murders that Holmes committed throughout his lifetime. Nobody knows exactly how many people he killed, especially since he was known to confess to the murders of people who were still alive. It was clear that in addition to being a habitual criminal, Holmes was also a liar. He enjoyed the notoriety he got after he started to make headlines for his alleged crimes, and he most likely fabricated some of the stories he told to keep his name in the headlines. His crimes were also sensationalized by the press, making it difficult to distinguish between which aspects of it are exaggerated and which are true. After receiving $7,500 from Hearst newspapers, Holmes confessed to nearly 30 murders in Chicago, Toronto, and Indianapolis. Historians have more realistically estimated the number of victims at around 10, including Holmes's business partner, 3 mistresses, a mistress's sister, and 4 kids. Holmes went on a murder spree in 1893 and was finally stopped the following year, when he was taken into custody in Philadelphia on a warrant for horse theft. He was only ever put on trial for the murder of his longtime business associate, Benjamin Pittersell. He initially insisted on representing himself, making him the first murder suspect in US history to invoke this right. But the trial proved to be more than he could handle on his own, and he ended up asking the judge to appoint 2 lawyers to defend him. Holmes was convicted of Pittersell's murder and was sentenced to death. While in prison awaiting his punishment, detectives searched his mansion and found evidence connecting him to 3 more murders, including Pittersell's 3 children. He was hanged in Philadelphia in 1896. Rumors about Holmes persist into the present day, despite experts claiming that the convicted serial killer's life wasn't quite as fascinating as people have made it out to be. In 2017, archaeologists exhumed his remains to prove to the public that he was actually dead, and that he hadn't somehow survived his execution like some believe. For good measure, they released a photo of his skeleton. Thanks for watching. Would you rather represent yourself in a misdemeanor case that carries up to a year in prison, or take a plea deal that involves spending 3 months in prison with no chance of early release? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.